Good afternoon. Hi, my name's Stephen McCombie, and this afternoon I'm going to talk about state-sponsored offensive cyber attacks. But before I do that, I'll just tell you a bit about myself, about my background, and where all this is coming from in terms of my ideas and my experience. I worked in cybersecurity for a very long time. I say 20 years, but probably more like 25. I originally was a police officer in Australia. I was a police detective, and I was involved in the mid-90s in doing computer crime cases, as we called them then. We call it cybercrime now, but back in those days it was computer crime. It was a really interesting time. A lot of the work really involved chasing up miscreants who were trying to show off how clever they were, trying to hack things, and also people that worked in companies sometimes who might use computer systems to commit fraud. Now, things have changed very dramatically since that time. After I spent that time in the police in the early 2000s, I ended up working for IBM. Obviously, IBM's a massive company with all sorts of organisations that it looks after, and I was in charge of what they call the CERT team. And a CERT team is the Computer Emergency Response Team. It's a bit like the fire brigade for cyber attacks. Basically, if there's a problem, that's who you call, and we'd have to come out and we'd respond to attacks of all different types, deal with them, try and clean up afterwards, investigate who was behind them, and try and stop them happening again. And that's a really interesting place to work when you're interested in cybersecurity, because you really learn about what are the real threats to organisations, what are actually things that are actually happening day to day. And what I really learned from that is that it isn't just the technical pieces, it's also about people. Cybersecurity is a people business. In the end, the people behind the code, behind the malware, behind the cyber attacks are people, and they've got the same intentions as other people. Sometimes they're trying to achieve things in the cyber world that they're trying to achieve in the real world as well. And that's always sort of stayed with me. And I suppose I've developed that idea over time. Later on, I worked for some other companies who dealt with attacks on banks. I worked for National Australia Bank in Australia, which at the time was Australia's largest bank. And a lot of the attacks were coming out of Eastern Europe. And there were organised crime groups who were trying to commit cyber fraud against our online bank at the time. And that was really interesting, understanding how they operated, how they were integrated in terms of money laundering, that sort of thing. And they were very different from these miscreant teenagers and perhaps disgruntled workers in companies we dealt with before. From that, I've worked in academia, worked at a university, did my PhD in computer science, and I looked at those Russian, Ukrainian groups as they were that targeted Australian banks in that time. So that was really interesting in terms of understanding their motivations. Then I ended up working for another company, a company called CSC, which is a bit like IBM really, running their Global Security Operations Centre, which was based in Sydney, funnily enough, even though it was an American company. And unlike the banks, they weren't worried about Russian cyber criminals. They were worried about Chinese spies who were using the internet to spy on them, because their customers were people like the US Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, the NSA, and other organisations. So our focus was very different in that job, and understanding what state actors are actually using the cyber for, which is what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So really, all that has taught me it's very important to understand threat actors, because they're driving the threats. They're driving the need for cybersecurity. Without threat actors, you don't need cybersecurity. That's the reality. We only do it because there are people that want to break it. So what do we need to know about when you're talking about cyber adversaries, as we call them? What's their interest in you? So are they interested in you as to take your money, to steal your intellectual property? Are you a pathway to someone else? Do you have secrets? Do you have military secrets? Do they want to degrade your activity? They want to stop you doing something. So that's really important. You need to understand that when you're thinking about which adversaries are you particularly concerned with. What are the capabilities of that adversary? Now, I talked before about teenagers or young people that are interested in showing off how clever they are with computing, or they've got a certain amount of capability in terms of their own skills, but also things available to them. Very different when we're talking about a nation state, or talking about the National Security Agency, like perhaps the peak in terms of technical capability. So that's really important. If the capabilities of your adversary are significant, then you have to think about what you need to defend and degrade their effectiveness. Then you look at a concept that's used in military terms called likely course of action. So once you understand who your adversary is, you understand why they're coming after you, understand what their capabilities are, what are they likely to do next? And that's something that militaries do in war. And then lastly, very importantly in cybersecurity, because we spend billions, trillions on cybersecurity measures, on technology, on resources, how do you spend your money and focus your efforts to focus on those cyber adversaries? So that's sort of where I've come from in terms of my thinking. This afternoon, we're going to talk a bit about some of the major nation states that are involved in offensive cyber. And I think you'll find it interesting. I'd like to keep it interactive. If you've got questions, happy for you to put them in, type them in, and I'll try and answer them as I go along. If not, I'll get to them at the end. But I'd really encourage that. I'll go through the different countries. I'll talk about a number of different countries, and perhaps I'll try and stop after each one if there are a few questions are banking up about that, and we can talk about that rather than just go all the way to the end. So there's a new concept called hybrid warfare. Basically, it's something we've seen in Ukraine, but it wasn't invented by the Russians necessarily. It's about using different techniques, cyber being one of them, in warfare. In fact, the Russians, I think, remarked about what happened in Syria in the Arab Spring as being the birth of hybrid warfare, using information technology, using social media as part of a broader campaign, perhaps with military action and other activity. And in a way, cyber is there to achieve things in the real world we might achieve by other means. It's just one way of doing it. And if you look at some of the famous cyber attacks, and one of the most famous cyber attacks, which I will talk about, is Stuxnet, which was on the Iranian nuclear facility in Natanz. Basically, the CIA were trying to cause damage to that, degrade the ability of the Iranians to develop a nuclear weapon as they were concerned, and they tried to put counterfeit centrifuges in that facility. So they basically sourced some, made them blow up under certain conditions and tried to get them into the facility. That failed. They couldn't get them in there. So then it turned to the NSA, who used cyber means to do exactly the same thing. So sometimes things that are happening in cyber are just another pathway for an organisation. And in warfare, cyber is now a new, what we call a domain of warfare. Traditional domains were always land and sea until the First World War, when obviously you had aircraft, so air became a domain. Then more recently space, and now cyber. So it's a new domain of warfare. So what we see in with Russia's invasion of Ukraine is we see that cyber is being used in conjunction with other abilities in those other domains. And the thing about cyber, it seems somewhat short of war. We see cyber attacks and we don't necessarily consider them an act of war. And that's an interesting thing in the current time where really we're seeing what I'd call a new, I've got a question already, a new Cold War that will feature lots of cyber attacks. Now a question from Mark Astro. Oh yes, we'll talk about China, Russia, North Korea, USA. Not too much about India or Turkey, but there's many things you can talk about in many countries, but I've only got a limited time. And Dick says, how can you give us a cybersecurity firm place in education? Yeah, I might leave Dick's question to the end. That's probably more reflecting on the talk. So yes, I'll go through the different countries. Now, obviously with my early research, I looked at Russia, learned a lot about organised crime, but also understood that organised crime is very closely linked with state security. And our good friend Vladimir Putin has also had a bit of history in terms of his experiences working for the government, but also working in the St. Petersburg as deputy mayor and being associated with organised crime there too. So Putin uses what is called active measures, and these are different ways of achieving the effect they want on countries that the USA or the Netherlands or Australia or whatever country they're actually dealing with. They are measures, not war measures, but measures short of that. It could be disinformation campaign. It could be stealing information about the 2016 election. It could be poisoning someone using nerve agents. These sort of small measures that are taken by their intelligence agencies traditionally. But he uses a range of different people. You see in the diagram, a range of different people to actually execute these things. He's got his traditional security agencies, which I'll talk about in a second. He's got organised crime. He's got the oligarchs. He's got various Russian businesses. So he uses all these different ways of actually doing active measures against his adversaries. Now, there's a long tradition of intelligence services in Russia. In fact, even before the October Revolution, when the Tsar was on the throne of Russia, there was the Okhrana, and the Okhrana was very effective in terms of a secret police force. So there's a great tradition in secret police forces in Russia. But obviously the KGB was very important. And it's interesting today, the KGB no longer exists, obviously, but a lot of the things, the people and the buildings and a lot of the techniques are still around. There's a great book, if you're interested in the history of the KGB, called the Mitrokhin Archive. And Mitrokhin was an interesting guy. He was a KGB agent, and his job was actually keeping the archive for the KGB. So he'd capture the history of all the information from all the records kept by the KGB over their history, about operations they were conducting, things they were doing. And he actually ended up defecting to the West and taking the archive with him. And they published this archive. So it's a fantastic resource. Interested in the history of intelligence should read the Mitrokhin Archive. And it talks a lot about some of the things, these active measures I talked about, from media manipulation to, to killing people. And in the Cold War, obviously, the United States was considered the main target, the main adversary, they used to call them, for these influence operations. Now, and if we think now in recent times about major attacks against the US, we probably think of the 2016 election. Hillary Clinton was obviously very concerned that Putin had actually stopped her getting elected and helped Trump get elected. And she was very vocal about it, as were many other people. I actually personally think it's a little bit more complicated than that, which I'll talk about in a second. But Vladimir Putin, of course, when he was interviewed by Oliver Stone, he said, "It's all lies. We didn't do that. We didn't influence the outcome of the elections," which on the face of it sounded like a bit disingenuous, but perhaps there's more to it than we think, and I'll talk about that in a second. So, in fact, 2016 was not the first election that the Russians tried to influence. In fact, under the Soviet Union, several elections were targets of disinformation campaigns by the Soviets. In '76, there was a fellow called Scoop Jackson who they tried to send out a fake FBI document saying he was homosexual because he wasn't married. But we don't know too much of the effectiveness of that. And then the '80s, Ronald Reagan, who was the great Cold Warrior, you may remember some of his statements about the evil empire, talking about the Soviet Union. He was a major target of the KGB of these active measure campaigns. Now, so there was a major exercise in '84 to stop him being re-elected, and the KGB made it their #1 target in terms of stopping him being elected. So I think there's a bit of a delay with the thing, but can anybody remember, anybody knows their history or someone that was around in 1984, whether Ronald Reagan was re-elected or not? I'll let you just think about that for a second. But obviously, these types of attacks are nothing new. And throughout the history of the Soviet Union and more recent Russia attacks on trying to influence elections or trying to discredit people or create distrust in government has been great. I don't think anybody's come up with whether they won or not. So we'll just go, we'll tell you, in fact, he won by a landslide. So the KGB campaign wasn't very effective. And that's the reality. Changing the result of elections hard. It's not easy. In fact, Reagan won 49 of 50 states. Mondale won 1, which was his home state, Minnesota. So after Reagan and George Bush, his successor, were these Cold Warriors, the Soviet Union actually fell apart. And Boris Yeltsin was the first president of Russia. And one of his first orders of business was actually dissolve the KGB. And they broke it up into various organisations, which I'll talk about in a second. But in a lot of ways, it's really more rebranding. And obviously one of the most famous KGB alumni was Putin himself. He'd been a KGB officer in East Germany. And here is a young man. So the Russian intelligence community, they have all these different agencies, which are sort of outlined there. This is a document by a fellow called Mark Galeotti, who's probably the world expert on Russian state security. Talks a lot about Putin as well. And this is the what we call in Australia, we call these swim lanes, roles and responsibilities. So it breaks it down, the different agencies there, the ones which I'll talk about, the SVR, which is the Foreign Intelligence Agency, the FSB, which I spoke about, I didn't speak about. It's essentially the internal security area for Russian intelligence, and the GRU, which is military intelligence. They've got different responsibilities. Some have a subsidiary role, but some have a main role. But the reality is they're actually all competing with each other, and I'll explain that in a second. Putin takes a lot of personal interest in intelligence matters and has a lot of reporting into various agencies, direct reporting to FSB and into the Security Council, which runs the different agencies. So he keeps these things very close to him. The main agency for a lot of these activities is the FSB. So this is this internal security agency. It's also responsible for the state borders and countries on the state border of Russia, but they're a very major agency, and in a lot of ways they're very much the successor to the KGB, and they're actually based in the Lubyanka, which is the old KGB headquarters. And those that know Russian history, the Lubyanka is where people got taken to the cells and shot under Stalin and other leaders. They're still in that building. And then you might wonder, so what's all this got to do with cybersecurity? Well, the KGB has an organisation within it called the Information Security Centre. So the Information Security Centre is basically the specialist cyber security part of the FSB. And it actually is in a building that used to belong to the KGB as well. It used to be the KGB Computer Centre. And they have a very close link with a couple of Russian companies, Kaspersky, antivirus company that you probably would have heard of, which is quite reasonably famous. Another company called Group IB, which you probably haven't heard of, which is basically a cyber intelligence company that sells intelligence about crime groups. But they are very closely linked in with the Information Security Centre, this KGB unit. One of the roles of this unit is actually international liaison for the FSB. They're a law enforcement agency, effectively, in the end of the day, much like the FBI in America. And when the FBI were investigating a case of Yahoo, where a hacker had broken into Yahoo and compromised 1 billion accounts, that's B for billion, one of the biggest, I think it's probably if you look at a number of accounts compromised, it's one of the largest breaches ever. They caught one of the guys in Canada, and the other guy escaped and went to Russia. So FBI, following their procedures, they approached the FSB. So the job of the FSB was obviously cooperating with them. So they said, okay, they contacted this unit, and the FBI said, we want this guy. And they said, okay, we'll track him down, we'll find him. So they dutifully found the guy, brought him in, and they turned him to work for them. So now this hacker turned over this access to all these Yahoo email accounts, these billion accounts, over to the FSB for intelligence purposes. So this is the FSB liaison in action. So the next unit I want to talk about is the GRU, which is the military intelligence, Russia's military intelligence. Very similar to the US Defense Intelligence Agency, if you know the DIA in America. It's a massive organisation. It employs about 6 times as many people as the Foreign Intelligence Organisation, the SVR, which I'll talk about in a second. A lot of technical expertise in terms of information warfare, cyber warfare, and they're believed to be the main group behind the DNC attack, the attack against the Democrat Party in America. So some very famous alumni there. Here's a young fellow here who's a bit more famous now, who was in Russian military intelligence and attended the KGB School of Cryptography, Telecommunication and Computer Sciences, and then became an officer in the Russian military intelligence. Can anybody guess who it might be? someone who I've mentioned briefly. Does he look at all familiar? He's a bit older and he's got a beard now. He's quite rich. It's Eugene Kaspersky. He was formerly in Russian military intelligence. And as I mentioned, his links in with the FSB are not accidental. Obviously, any Russian company that want to operate out of Russia has to pay attention to what the government wants in Russia. But Kaspersky is at the point where the US government's actually banned using Kaspersky on their government systems because of concerns around what actually might happen. And in fact, the Israelis told them that the Kaspersky was actively using a capability within their antivirus to copy files from government systems and pass them on to Russian intelligence. So the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, have just built a new building in Moscow. It cost a couple of $100 million. Obviously, they're a very important part of the Russian military and the intelligence apparatus. Here is a diagram of the building here. It's quite a huge facility. As I say, they're a huge organisation with 6 times as many agents as the Foreign Intelligence Agency. And they do a lot of stuff outside of Russia. They're not necessarily related to military matters. So a very famous case recently that you'd probably be aware of was in the United Kingdom, in England. They put Novichok on a doorknob to try and kill a former Russian intelligence agent, a former GRU agent. He got very sick, and his wife got very sick, but it ended up killing an innocent party who ended up touching the bottle that was used to actually spread this Novichok. Interesting enough, the cyber part of this is actually something that happened in the Netherlands. What happened was the OPCW, the organisation for I can't see what the P stands for chemical weapons, basically examines chemical weapons case, which is in The Hague, was investigating this case. So what the GRU did is they sent some agents there to try and spy on the OPCW, Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, Organisation of Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is the correct acronym. And here's a photo taken in Schiphol Airport of them there being brought in, a number of agents there. One of them there is actually a fellow who's a cyber operator. So they sent cyber people to try and spy on the OPCW. They rented a car. They parked it next door to the OPCW in a hotel. And they had all these devices in the back to try and break into the Wi-Fi network at OPCW. So here's some agents from Russian military intelligence actually breaking into systems in the OPCW in The Hague. Now, the Netherlands intelligence were well ahead of the game. They'd actually already compromised Russian military intelligence before this even happened. And in fact, were aware of them coming and monitored them, and these guys were arrested. One little side story about this is when they were searching one of these guys, in his pocket he had a taxi receipt for travelling from GRU office to the airport, which just reminds you that even Russian military intelligence are bureaucratic, like many government organisations. You need to have your receipts if you want to get things paid. Another organisation is the Foreign Intelligence Service, and this is really the traditional service that spies overseas. Perhaps not as prominent as the FSB or the GRU. They are famous for what they call the illegals. Now, the illegals are basically people placed in countries who are under false identities, not associated with the embassies, but actually under false identities. And these illegals, there's actually a TV show that you may have watched called The Americans, which is about some illegals. There's a fictional version that were in America. It's actually a very good show. But the FBI actually arrested 10 of these illegals in America who are under false IDs, using the IDs of people that were dead, or for some reason they were able to take over their identities, and they were arrested. They end up being released in a prisoner exchange. So they're the Foreign Intelligence Agency, the James Bond type characters for Russia. So I mentioned before about the swim lanes for Russian intelligence. In fact, there's a lot of competition in intelligence circles. And in fact, these agencies are competing for Putin's attention. So often they're doing operations in the same place. In fact, in 2016, when the Democratic National Committee was broken into, it was broken into by the FSB and by Russian military intelligence, and they didn't know each other were in there. So these were competing intelligence operations, not cooperative ones, as I say. And in a way, FSB has been favoured by Putin because he's felt it's more successful, but also he was also, apart from being the KGB, he was one of the first heads of the FSB. So there's this competition going on. He always felt that the SVR was a bit too conservative. So there's this interesting concept of competition between the intelligence agencies, not sticking bureaucratically to their tasks. But it's been effective. They've been very effective as a result. Now, obviously, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've learned a lot about the border areas and the views about NATO by Russia. And in a lot of ways, that also influences their cyber activity. When you think in their terms, they see NATO as the adversary to the old Warsaw Pact and therefore anti-Russia. So a lot of activities around their border are particularly sensitive, and that's why we see an invasion of Ukraine today. They're very concerned about the government of Belarus. All these border areas are particularly important. And the other aspect is, apart from their vicinity to Russia, is also the fact that lots of ethnic Russians, this is a very old diagram, but makes the point, ethnic Russians are in these places. Primarily because the Soviet Union did move people around, but these borders are established. So there is a Russian ethnic community in a lot of these places. And one of the things I did learn about Russian organised crime is where there's large Russian communities, they usually have some opportunities. So you tend to see Russian organised crime in the countries where there's these big communities. Now, obviously, Ukraine in 2014 got rid of the Russian-friendly government, and as a result, have been the target of Russian aggression since. With the takeover of the Crimea and the Donetsk regions, the Donbass regions. But a lot of these attacks, these cyber incidents that we see out of Russia, are related to this border issue. So in 2017, one of the very early attacks, there was a big DDoS attack. A DDoS attack is just basically sending a lot of traffic to close websites down, close systems down against Estonia. And Estonia at the time was E-enabled. I mean, many countries are like that now, but in 2007, Estonia was well ahead of that. And it was really, the reason they did a big DDoS attack was because of essentially Russian pride. A statue, you can see a picture of it there, which was in the centre of the capital of Estonia, was moved outside to a park where their photos taken, and it was seen as a criticism or a lack of respect for what the Russians had done in the Second World War. Those are the history of Russia. A lot of Russians think that World War II is a very sacred memory about the sacrifice. So as a result, there was this big DDoS attack on Estonia. In 2008, there was an invasion, perhaps a smaller scale as what we're seeing in Ukraine, but an invasion all the same, along with a whole bunch of cyber attacks. So this hybrid warfare, as I mentioned. And then Ukraine's been hit by a series of cyber attacks, some targeting IT, some hitting SCADA. Very famously, Kiev's been blacked out by these attacks. Destructive attacks in 2017, NotPetya, you may remember, which also end up hitting a lot of Western countries, including companies like Maersk. And then in the recent war, a whole range of cyber attacks in conjunction with that warfare. So that's in Eastern Europe. So in terms of other attacks, I talked about Yahoo, the fact that the Russians recruited the Yahoo hacker to work for them to do intelligence. The attacks on the 2016 election, which I'll talk a bit about. Other things in the 2016 election, not just the breaking into DNC, there were other things they're up to. Shadow brokers, which was basically stealing NSA tools that had been developed. The actions in the French election. Another one called Tainted Leaks, which is about targeting critics of Russia by putting out false information about them. A lot of more US election activity in the midterms and the presidential election in 2020. COVID disinformation, you'd remember there was a lot of disinformation. A lot of it was coming out of Russia. And then SolarWinds, which was a very major attack against a network application that was used right throughout every major corporate, which the head of Microsoft called the most significant cyber attack in history. So not to be understated. So this is an interesting little room in the DNC office. They like to celebrate things that have happened there. You see a picture there of Barack Obama on the wall. And then on the other side, there's a filing cabinet, which looks a bit broken. And then on a table, something sitting on the table, which is actually a computer. So that's actually the computer that the Russians broke into. Now they have it on display at the DNC very proudly. And, oh, hang on. What about the Petya attack? How does that fit in? Someone's asking a question. So what about the NotPetya attack? How does that fit in? So NotPetya was this attack. I'll just go back to that question. In 2017, a destructive attack using NotPetya. And basically that was launched on the National Day of Ukraine. You might not know that. And just in terms of hybrid warfare, on the same day, they killed the head of Ukrainian military intelligence. They blew up his car. So again, many different actions in different domains of warfare, you might say. So basically the FBI and the NSA did a very good job of investigating the breaches. Perhaps after the event, maybe they could have done it a bit before, but they would identify a lot of different. You can see there from the wanted poster that the FBI put out for Russian military intelligence, some FSB guys, in regard to the attack. So what did they do? So they basically stole a whole bunch of email from the DNC, a lot of it very embarrassing. And there were all sorts of impacts. Debbie Wasserman, who was the head of the DNC, ended up having to resign because of some things around, and this was the biggest problem, that looks like Bernie Sanders wasn't being given quite the opportunity that Hillary Clinton was, and that was sort of clear in some emails, or at least that was suggested. And that played into certainly the Sanders campaign, but also criticism of Hillary Clinton. But also other elections were impacted. There were various candidates compromised by that. But as I said, it played into this concept that the Sanders campaign had been silenced. But that was not all they did. They also actually attacked electoral authorities. So in the states, they broke into a number of state organisations looked after electoral systems and kept records on voters and exfiltrated records. We don't know whether they did anything effective with those, but there's certainly it was recorded. They also tried to break into electronic voting vendors. So they have electronic voting systems in America in polling booths and externally, and they broke into those as well. Again, we don't know what they did with them, but there was a multifaceted attack. The other part of it was what they call the troll farms, and the most famous troll farm was the Internet Research Agency based out of St. Petersburg. And basically it was about people pretending to be Americans in social media that were actually Russians, planting disinformation. In a way, they were trying to focus criticism on various candidates, most specifically Hillary Clinton, and they were actually financed by a fellow called Putin's chef, who we'll talk about in a second, Pidzagizin. And he actually set up this business to do this troll farming, this actually setting up criticism of these various candidates. And they actually set up real events, so physical events. Here's just a few of them there. Some were pro-Trump, some were anti-Hillary, some were actually anti-Trump, which I'll talk about in a second, which is an interesting concept. One of my favourites was actually one that was actually in Miami, where they hired an actor and actress to play Hillary and Clinton and Bill Clinton and put them in a cage and had a protest. This was all organised by people pretending to be Americans. Lots of Americans turned up, but on using social media. So they used social media in this attack. But interestingly enough, a lot of the attacks didn't actually necessarily relate to the candidates. You can see this map of where the IRA posts were located. And you can see 265 in the middle of America there, that's Missouri. And the reason that we see 265 posts there is because it related to the treatment of blacks by American law enforcement. So in effect, what they were trying to do was drive divisions in American society by extenuating things that already exist. Rather than actually necessarily supporting one campaign over the other, they wanted to actually cause a divided society, because that's effectively what they're trying to do. Okay, so the last Russian organisation I'll talk about is what we call FAPSI. Now, FAPSI was effectively the Russian NSA, and this is an important link. It's actually not around anymore. It was actually disbanded. And they did a lot of stuff around commercial systems, financial information of the West when it was around. Many of the members of FAPSI were recruited by organised crime. So these highly trained cyber warriors, you might call them, went into organised crime. And it's one of the year, and I know this from my research and from my work, the year this happened was the year that the attacks on internet banks became a big problem. And the irony is that the FAPSI people are probably well known to people now in the FSB and the GRU. In fact, some of the FAPSI people are in the FSB and the GRU as well, and they're all closely linked. So the network between organised crime and Russian state security is very close. It's very important. A couple of other organisations I'll mention: Cyber Berkut, which is this Ukrainian ethnic Russian group in Ukraine that do cyber attacks as well, or a proxy. I mentioned this COVID-19 disinformation, and SolarWinds, which was this major attack. Those you following the Russian invasion of Ukraine might have heard of the Wagner Group, and they also were in Syria. They're most mercenaries employed by, you guessed it, Putin's chef, the same one that runs the IRA, and they're doing normal military operations. So there's a very strong link between these cyber attacks and physical attacks in different domains. Since the invasion of Ukraine, there's been a whole series of cyber attacks, some prior to the invasion. On the day of the invasion, the satellite systems in Ukraine, the base stations were disabled on the same day as the invasion. And there's been a whole series, I won't go through them all, I probably haven't got enough time, a whole series of attacks. You can see there right up to the invasion begins. There's a very nice document from Microsoft, if you want to read it, that goes through the various attacks. Some of them are attacks against infrastructure, some are against just defacements, some are destructive attacks, a range of different attacks against government institutions, private institutions in Ukraine, but all in conjunction with this attack. And nicely lining up, also in the Microsoft report, is these three intelligence agencies closely linked: the GRU, the SVR and the FSB, with various attacks during this period right up to date. So that's the end of the Russia section. I've probably gone on a lot there. Russia's probably my area of speciality, but I'm going to talk about a number of countries. But I just thought maybe if I've got any questions about Russia, you could ask them now. Otherwise, I'll proceed to talk about China, the other major player. So China, it's interesting. So if there's any questions then, feel free to ask about Russia. China obviously is a country that we're very focused on in Australia. And certainly the defence establishment in Australia is very concerned about China, and issues around the South China Sea and the rise of China are a big concern in Australia. And it's interesting, knowing a lot about Russia, I probably knew less about China until more recent times, but obviously working in cybersecurity in Australia, you learn a lot about what's actually going on. Now, in a lot of ways, China's activities, again, much like Russia, they're very much aligned to things they're doing in the physical world. They're interested in psychological warfare, public opinion warfare. All these sort of things are important. They're also interested in IP theft. They're looking to get intellectual property, whether it be fashion or military or technology. It's very important because the official strategy of China is to actually build their capability, and that official policy is supported by this IP theft. Now, the two major organisations in China, government organisations, are the Ministry of State Security, which is this intelligence agency responsible for overseas intelligence, but also interested in looking out for minority groups within China, Tibetans, Uyghurs, that sort of thing. And then you've got the PLA, which is the Chinese military. The PLA have a huge information warfare units with over 150,000 people in them, and they have a lot of offensive capabilities. They use information warfare and espionage. So we have to go back a few years for the origins of the the Chinese cyber capability. It was a Freudian slip. Back in the 1990s, the Chinese actually observed what the US was doing in Yugoslavia with targeting IT systems, and they became very concerned that they needed that capability. So in a way, and Russia might claim the same, that all of this cyber activity is in response to other countries. There was a jet downed over Hainan in 2000, and it's led to a worm, bit of malware, a virus attack on a whole bunch of systems called Code Red, and that was one of the first attacks by these patriotic hackers, as they called them. Perhaps not military, but patriotic hackers. By 2004, PLA units were actually attacking US military networks. Titan Reign's one of the early ones. PLA in 2010 started their PLA Cyber Command specialist area. The current commander is this gentleman here, Lieutenant General Lee. They also look up the Space Command. So they've got this very specialised unit. So counterintelligence, Trinity in China. They have laws to integrate counterintelligence efforts, improve communications between agencies. They've got a very broad concept of national security, protecting China from all sorts of what they see as foreign influence. So in terms of intellectual property theft and confidential information theft, one of the most interesting attacks from an Australia perspective is on the Australian mining sector. Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton and Fortescue Metal Groups were all targeted by Chinese groups going right back to 2008. Some of the information that they managed to get was the negotiating positions, the pricing that these big Australian mining companies wanted to actually do with China. And the head of MI5, that's the British counterintelligence agency, I think that the attack on Rio Tinto alone, which Rio Tinto is based in the UK, that's why they're interested in it, even though they do a lot of stuff in Australia, was over $1 billion. So just from that information, it was worth $1 billion. But they're not interested in that sort of information. They're also interested in techniques, production methods, chemical formula, software, all sorts of things. So it's very important. So that's the IP side. Another area is, I mentioned before about the Ministry of State Security being concerned about protests by minority groups, and the Tibetan in particular is an area. And back in 2009, the Chinese sent out a phishing email to try and catch out people supporting Tibetan groups, and the attack was called GhostNet, where there was a very good report done by Citizen Lab, which is in Canada, and they broke down the countries they hit. Obviously, lots of Western countries, Vietnam, obviously, which is a traditional adversary of China as well. And they were looking for information about what Chinese dissidents were doing in China from outside organisations. In 2013, Mandiant, which is a big American cyber intelligence and incident response company you may have heard of, published a report on APT1. It was basically identifying a PLA unit, a Chinese military unit that targeted various organisations and military organisations in America, and were able to actually identify exactly where they were located. Here they point out where their office was. They looked at all the different countries they targeted, and you can see it's hitting various countries that are natural adversaries of China. I've just got a question from Leon. Russia and China benefit from economic cooperation with the West. Yes, definitely. At the same time, they're behaving like hostile towards the West with these cyber attacks. Why are they using this contradictory strategy? I think the idea is that what they can get away with. I think, unfortunately, and I don't think the only people that try this, but certainly it's interesting Russia's position now as more of a pariah. But in 2008, I can remember Vladimir Putin went to the NATO meeting and spoke about Russia's position. So things have changed a lot over time. But I think, like any country, whatever they can get away with. It was a long time before anybody called China out or Russia out in these things. So I suppose they were just, they're trying it on. So just like the attacks by the Russians, the FBI's indicted Chinese PLA officers who were involved in these attacks. And this is a technique used by the US to try and discourage people from getting involved in this type of activity, showing countries that they know what they're doing. And perhaps for the next generation of cyber warriors, saying if you want to go and spy for China or Russia, you're not going to be able to travel the world. You're going to have a red notice from Interpol. Another group that CrowdStrike talked about was Panda. It's just interesting about the use of social media for intelligence purposes. The CrowdStrike able to identify a particular individual that was tied up with this particular PLA group through social media accounts. He had lots of nice photos of his room showing his military uniforms. He meant doing some exercises outside and the view from his window, and they worked out, well, this is where this PLA base is. So it was very easily identified. Again, Department of Justice, FBI, they indict these guys. So there's a range of attacks going on. All sorts of complaints in America about all the devices that are available that are made in China. This was some military camera that had a screen that had made in China written on it. So it's a major problem for components when we're concerned about Chinese spying for the America anyway. So a number of attacks happened in America, one against Anthem, which is a health company, another one against Marriott. And you might say, well, what's that got to do with spying? Well, it's really important. If you know the health records of people and you know if they've stayed in the Marriott, Americans love to stay in Marriotts. That's very important intelligence information about the movement of people. Obviously, Huawei's been a major concern for a lot of Western countries about being involved in the 5G network. Some people say that Huawei is funded by the Chinese Communist Party. There's been a lot of different positions on it. So it's an interesting one. The Chinese might say that American companies and Western companies do the same, but I think the jury is still out in that. So a really interesting case, which I'm going to talk about from a couple of different aspects, is what we call the Opm breaches. Now, Opm is the Office of Personnel Management. So the Office of Personnel Management basically handles the clearance records. This is a clearance form to work for the US government. And apparently 21.5 million of these were stolen by China. Obviously an incredible intelligence coup, and meant that every person, I think it was over about a 10-year period of time, who had applied to work for the US government, all their details of their personal details, their family, health records, financial records, are known to the Chinese. So it's an incredible intelligence trove. And there's just a graph thing showing that the attack happened first against a provider for the OPM and then OPM itself. It was a bit of a ridiculous situation. I'll share the URL of this particular congressional hearing where the head of OPM tries to explain why they were broken into, not very effectively. So I'm sort of finishing up with China. Any questions about China in terms of those attacks? So I'll turn to the West now. Obviously, America has a very significant power in terms of cyber, and I want to talk about this OPM breach, this Chinese breach into OPM. There's a famous guy you may know called Michael Hayden, who was not only director of the CIA, he was also director of the NSA. He had been a military officer. And he gave an interview after he'd left government service about the OPM attack, and it's very interesting in what he says. Hopefully we'll get it to work.
Can you just, if you would, from your perspective, with all of your experience in the intelligence and security worlds, just tell us how serious a breach this is?
So, first of all, I don't have any inside knowledge, but I'm reading actually very good reporting in the journal about this. And so I think the current story is this was done by the Ministry of State Security, which is roughly, very roughly, the equivalent of CIA in the Chinese system, whereas PLA 3, People's Liberation Army Department 3, is roughly the equivalent of NSA. So this was done on behalf of the Chinese Human Intelligence Services. So that's one fact. Second fact, those records are a legitimate foreign intelligence target. If I, as director of CIA or NSA, would have had the opportunity to grab the equivalent in the Chinese system, I would not have thought twice. I would not have asked permission. I'd have launched the Starfleet, and we would have brought those suckers home at the speed of light. So this is not shame on China. This is shame on us for not protecting that kind of information. And then finally, so what can you do with this? So you kind of create this massive database, this kind of Home Depot warehouse of information on Americans employed by the US government. Some have suggested that you could use this for blackmail. Not so much. This is actually information on you that is known to your government.
So a very important point made there. They see it, well, he, quite honestly, I congratulate him on his candor, as a legitimate intelligence exercise that they would have done themselves. So that's what you need to remember when you think about these cyber attacks. Both sides are doing, they're not doing everything to each other, but there's certainly a lot of similarity in some of the attacks. The USA obviously has a very significant investment in cybersecurity, in offensive cybersecurity, and the NSA, the National Security Agency, is the most important part of that. They date back to the Second World War, where they were code breaking. In 1952, the modern organisation was started. They were kind of largely unknown until 1982, when a fellow called James Bamford wrote a book called The Puzzle Palace, which I'd recommend if you're interested in that sort of thing, about them, talking about all the intelligence that they were gathering through electronic means. And Edward Snowden, some people think he's a traitor, some people think he's actually a dissident, someone's actually a whistleblower. He gave us a lot of information about the operations that the NSA have been doing in terms of spying on other countries, but also spying on Americans. So in terms of cyber, the biggest thing was Stuxnet, which I talked about. And the unit that actually did that is called the TAO, the Tailored Access Operations. They're these really specialist ethical, or not ethical, hackers that can break into systems. And they're actually run by, or were run by a fellow called Rob Joyce, and he talked about the TAO, about persistence, how you get into organisations, persistence. They know the network better than you do. So you're the victim, they know your network so well, and they're so persistent, they'll get in. And that's what he talked about, this TAO, this very, very highly capable unit of breaking into any system. There's a video which you can watch later. I'll share some of the URLs with you. Him talking about how they operate. I think he was speaking. It might have been at I was at Usenix's conference. The TAO itself has a number of bases, but there's one in San Antonio, which Der Spiegel wrote about. Obviously, these bases are largely secret, which actually spies on Mexico and countries in that region. They broke into, and we know this from Snowden, they broke into Mexican Secretariat of Public Security, so basically their national law enforcement, to basically spy on the Mexicans. So there's a lot of activity going on there by the NSA. The Central Intelligence Agency too does hacking, and basically a whole bunch of their tools were actually leaked to WikiLeaks in 2017 and they had a global hacking program. They use a lot of malware to try and compromise people, using people's iPhones and smart TVs as covert microphones, that sort of thing. They have a base in Frankfurt, which they use against lots of people. Sometimes they spy on people you think might be their friends. They famously listened into Angela Merkel's phone calls, spied on the French elections, a number of other things. And the interesting thing about what they call the Five Eyes, which is Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, and the US, they tend not to spy on each other. They've got a bit of an agreement. They share intelligence, but everyone else is open to be spied on. So I know Australia in particular spied on Papua New Guinea, who we work very closely with, and also on East Timor when we're negotiating with them over the what we call the Timor Gap, which is up for oil. So there's lots of spying going on by lots of people. Even the Chinese have called out saying that the surveillance system used in China to surveil Chinese people has been compromised by the Americans. Again, here's if you've got time, nice little documentary about the US Cyber Command, which is the associated with the NSA, but it's a different organisation. It's actually the military's focus on defending America. That's really interesting in terms of understanding how they operate. So then we move to some of the other Western countries. Britain has a long history of signals intelligence. You'd all remember Enigma and breaking the Germans' code and finding out about the submarines. You might know that story. That morphed into the GCHQ, which now has this major cybersecurity mission. And the head of GCHQ talked about we have a range of online capabilities we can do things with. And apart from spying on the Russians, the Chinese, they also spied on the Belgians. Very famously, they broke into a company called Belgicon. They were effectively interested in some data traffic out of Africa and the Middle East, but having said that, they're listening to all sorts of communications that the Belgicon look after, including NATO headquarters in Brussels, funnily enough, the European Commission, European Parliament, European Council. So lots of stuff happening by Britain. So again, I think, as I said in the intro to this, sometimes they're spying on who you think are friends as well. Australia, just a quick little Australian story. Australia quickly changed from where it was about an industry-based cybersecurity effort to one where it became a defence thing. So basically, the AusCert was in a university back in 1993. By the early 2000s, it started to do more stuff for federal government, and then eventually federal government took it over. Was in the Attorney General's department, and now it's in the military. So the military look after it. They do a lot of traditional spying. At the same time, they're supposed to be responsible for protecting Australia. It's interesting contrast, and they're the gamekeeper, and also they're out there trying to steal things. So, and it's been used effectively in a number of areas, but one that they talked about was against ISIS. They actually took out a bunch of ISIS computer systems as part of military operations. So again, Australia is also in this game. So North Korea, which obviously people do talk about. North Korea is an interesting case because basically they're also using cybercrime as a way of actually making money, and they're quite reckless in their activities. It's all military, basically, under the Reconnaissance General Bureau. And basically, they do a lot of operations out of China because obviously the internet connectivity in North Korea is not so great. They particularly target South Korea, but also the United States and Japan. They use a lot of different techniques. Again, it's this thing about using cyber as another means of achieving what you might try and achieve in the real world. They do cyber crime to make money. They sell drugs to make money. They do make counterfeit $100 notes, US dollar notes. So a range of things to make money, but also things of particular concern. Obviously, they're trying to do stuff against South Korea. That very famously, they did this destructive attack against the South Koreans, against the banking system. But even probably more famous in the West is this attack on Sony's computer systems over the interview. So basically, the North Korean hierarchy wasn't very happy about this movie, and they actually attacked Sony as a result. And again, there's a URL there you can have a look at if you've got time. There's a movie called Perfect Weapon, and they talk a lot about the Sony hack, about how it sort of changed things. I'll just keep going. You would have probably remembered there was an attack against Bangladesh Bank by the North Koreans, where they basically broke into their SWIFT is basically the system that banks operate to share money between themselves. So it's the back end of the banking system that we don't see. And these are big transactions. Basically, there was some large transactions done when they broke into this Bangladesh bank. They didn't get away with a lot of it, but they got away with some. They laundered it through the Philippines, it turned out. But again, it's one of these techniques that the North Koreans are using to gather money because they're short of foreign income coming in. So cybercrime is another way they make that money. Here's just some diagrams. Now, one of the very famous impactful attacks, I always like this picture because it's a German train sign. Obviously, the computer that was showing the details got hit by WannaCry, which was this ransomware that the North Koreans launched to actually try and make money. It probably went a lot wider than they thought. North Korea, they're very concerned about their threats to international finance because they're not part of the international finance system, which harking back to about Russia, probably one of the concerns is with Russia, they're probably a little less restrained in terms of their attacks as they get slowly isolated over what they're doing. So that's North Korea. Another big player in this space is Israel. Obviously, they've got an amazing capability in terms of, and there's so many cybersecurity companies in Israel that you're probably aware of, and a lot of it's driven out of their military and their intelligence services. There's something called 8200 Unit 8200, which is a very important, again, started signals intelligence unit back in the wars against the Arab states, and it's become this cyber unit. And basically, they use it for all sorts of reasons. Again, there's a video there you can watch because I'll share these slides. I think someone's just asked me to share the slides, which I'll do, which you can watch, which talks about the activities of this unit, very advanced. But they actually use social media and breaking into computers to find out information about individuals in the Palestinian territories, perhaps that they're gay or they're having an affair, and they use that information in intelligence operations to turn that person into actually being an informant for the Israelis. And it was kind of so controversial that people from 8200 from the unit actually protested against them doing it. So interesting story. The Israelis, are very effective at using cyber methods in terms of they talk about the invisible hand, about using cyber as a method. You never know when the attack might happen. But interestingly enough, we talk about cyber being short of war. In some cases, maybe not. Basically, what happened was the Hamas, who were in Gaza, did a cyber attack against some Israeli government systems, against trying to actually cause some impacts to Israel. And so the Israelis targeted the building that this cyber unit was actually based out of and blew it up. So it's like a case of where cyber became real warfare. As I mentioned, Israel has significant industries in this space. NSO Group is quite famous because for Pegasus, which is basically a tool used on mobile devices to spy on them. Very famously, the Saudi dissident journalist who was chopped up by the Saudis, he apparently had this NSO on his phone, and was the Saudis were paying NSO to use this software against him. There's lots I've written about that if you want to read about it. Citizen Lab, again, which I mentioned before, it's a Canadian organisation, wrote a very good report about it. So that's Israel. So I might just stop. I've talked about a couple of countries there, North Korea, Israel, the West. Any questions on that before I push on? Someone asked, what should we worry us more, military hacks or economic hacks? I think my message is, which I sort of started with, was it's all about who's interested in you. If you've got a company and you do work for the Defense Department, then you probably should look out for military hacks. If you're a bank, you're probably more worried about economic hacks. But it's having that understanding of the attackers that are coming after you. Because it's about what are they trying to achieve. It's not just random. A lot of it's very targeted. So if there's no questions about those other countries, I might keep going, just in the interest of time. So another country which I mentioned before, which was a victim of a cyber attack, was Iran. But they've actually developed quite a big cyber capability. So basically what happened, much like when we talked about China looking at what are the Americans doing in Yugoslavia, they were concerned about Stuxnet. Stuxnet, and here's Ahmadinejad walking through the very facility that they attacked. They were concerned about these attacks on the on Iran's systems, and they said we need to develop a capability. So they actually built up cyber units very quickly, and there was actually some hackers in Iran that were used to deface websites and things. And basically, what happened to them is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard approached them and said, because in Iran you have to do national service. They said, instead of doing national service, we want you to come and work for us and hack these people. So they started actually working on these hacks against the West. And a really significant one was what's called Shamoon, which was in 2012, which was against Saudi Aramco and Qatar Gas. And basically, it was a destructive malware that wiped all these systems. In fact, it caused the cost of hard disks to globally go up. Is there a country that doesn't use cyber? I'll come to that in a second. But so basically, they wiped all these disks. And what it meant was, because it was IT systems, so the OT network wasn't affected. But what actually it meant was that they couldn't actually charge for the oil that they produced. So for 1 month, they could not charge, so they gave it away, because it was easier to give it away than trying to work out a way of capturing that. And recently, they actually looked at their revenue. So is equivalent to a $30 billion loss. So this attack cost $30 billion. So it's probably one of the largest ever. So it was back in 2012. Just shows you in terms of they wanted to impact Saudis. Obviously, the Iranians, the Saudis are great enemies of the Iranians, and they did this attack. The Iranians then targeted US banks with DDoS attacks. And interesting enough, the US government was approached by a number of banks. The president was approached by a number of banks, and he felt that was really the cost of doing business. He didn't want to take any military action against Iran or any other action. But in the case of North Korea, with Sony, they decided that was too much, and they decided they needed to respond. So again, it's interesting about developing this rules of the road for cyber attacks. Again, as we saw in these other attacks, they pretty quickly identified these guys. Some of these guys are these hackers that were hired. Some others were brought in from various places, from universities, to do these attacks. Again, obviously these people can never travel. And here's just some of the, I mentioned before that these people used to do defacements. The Revolutionary Guard did some attacks, and this is just a diagram. A fellow called Tim Mora, who's written about proxies, cyber proxies, and there's a great example of cyber proxies where they brought these people in that were hackers and got them into the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to do these attacks, and actually improved their activities. So one particular attack, is there a state actor? I'll talk more generally about the state actors, but I just want to sort of stick with the theme of the various things first. But I'll come back to I've got a couple of questions about the general picture about cyber attacks, but I'll come back to that. But Iran used a very interesting attack. Basically, there was a gentleman that worked in the Saudi Defense Department who was quite senior. And what happened was he was on LinkedIn, like many of us are. I'm on LinkedIn. He got a LinkedIn request from a lady who was a photographer in the UK, and she was quite attractive, so accepted. Eventually, she made contact with him on Facebook. They got quite friendly. They had a lot of interaction. She sent a lot of photos to him. He sent photos. Eventually, she said to him, I need you to help me. I'm just trying to get this bit of software working. Can you run it on your computer? And he said, I'm at work. He said, and can you do it now? So he went, okay, I'll do it. So he ran this software that she'd sent him, which was supposedly for some innocent purpose. But in fact, it wasn't a attractive photographer from from Britain at all. It was actually a Iranian Revolutionary Guard soldier with a big long beard who was tricking this guy. So basically, they used the old honey net, the honey pot technique, where you have an attractive girl or an attractive guy approach someone and make them vulnerable. This is using social networking, which we so trust, to do the same thing. So basically, they were able to compromise the Saudi Defense Force by using these fake identities on LinkedIn. And I must admit, when I first saw it in 2017, I think when it first came out, I thought, man, I've got to be careful about LinkedIn, because you don't know you have no idea who you're talking to, really. You might think you have some idea. Now, lots of other countries have been involved in attacks. I mentioned the Dutch intelligence. They actually hacked into the GRU, and lots of other organisations, and also they involved in Stuxnet to some extent. Germany too was involved in getting information for Siemens for the Stuxnet attack. Lots of other countries, Singapore, India, you name it. I could talk for many hours about this, but I'll lose my voice. But I suppose the point is, and I'll go back to the question here: is there any country that doesn't use cyber? I don't think so. I don't think anybody has said that we will not use cyber as a technique. Obviously, some countries are probably use very basic techniques, but I think it's used by all countries. And the problem is, in some ways, which takes me nicely to my conclusion slide. So all the major states have got a quite a significant offensive cyber capability. This is just some examples. In a lot of ways, what they're doing is similar. Now, some people say there's a line, and Russia crosses the line or China crosses the line. I think it's a more complicated discussion about cyber. What is the line? We have the Tallinn Convention about cyber warriors, but no one really seems to have signed up to that. The problem is that the West, and in particular the United States and Britain, have such fantastic capability in cyber. They don't necessarily want to limit their capability by signing up to some agreement, which they may think, we'll obey it, but the other side won't. So this is the challenge. There's no agreed rules in this offensive cyber going on. You look at the way Russia operates, but in a way a lot of other countries operate the same. It can be a military operation, it can be an intelligence operation, it can be private partners. I talked about patriotic hackers in China and in Russia, and you look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. There's lots of people with sympathy for Ukraine that are attacking Russia. I'm seeing all my typos now, so apologies for that. So it's becoming part of all these different aspects of what nation states are trying to do, and using all sorts of different people to actually execute them for them. And it's part of their war plans. So when the US is going to invade Iran, if they want to invade Iran, there's a whole series of cyber aspects to that attack. Just as when the Russians invaded, not that they did it particularly well, Ukraine, there was a series of cyber attacks associated with that. So that's sort of the conclusion. So I'll just come to your questions now. So any questions you have, feel free to ask. Got a couple here. Back to China. So back to China, what is your opinion on the widespread use of Chinese IT hardware and software? I think it's a really controversial one. I was going to talk a bit about Huawei. I think in a way Huawei, I mean, you can understand concerns, but maybe if we adopted the same rule, when we look at how the NSA was able to access data from American companies, it isn't, maybe we're more concerned there's less likely to be some sort of oversight in China than there is in America, but it's not dramatically different necessarily. And you can bet if the CIA or the NSA or the FBI are interested in something you're doing, I don't think many American organisations. I mean, Apple Computer famously stood up when they wanted to look at the iPhones. They ended up finding some Israeli software to break into them instead. But I think perhaps it's kind of a bit tough on China. I don't see that there's enough documented cases where China uses technology specifically to spy. more that it's been doing offensive operations just like the US has, just like Russia has, just like China has. The problem is there's Chinese technology in everything. And I suppose that's the challenge. You know, you probably don't have a Russian chip in your phone, but I bet you've got a Chinese chip in there somewhere running something. Is there a regulation in place in the UN? I mean, there is a cybercrime convention, which a lot of people have signed. But in effect, they're not talking about the government stuff. There really isn't an agreement in terms of activity. I think what happened when Barack Obama was president, he had some running agreement with Xi from China that they wouldn't hack each other. I think that lasted about 6 months, and that sort of just seemed to go away. It all started again after that. And the problem is that the capabilities are so significant that countries don't want to trade that away. And that's the problem. So any insight about cyber actions between China and Russia? I think it's interesting how they work. It's interesting how countries work together, because one interesting thing, not China and Russia so much, but is you look at what North Korea were doing, and they had this destructive malware they hit the South Korean banks with. And then magically, about 6 months later, the Iranians hit the Saudis with just the same sort of destructive malware. So there is you might call it sharing of tools, cyber tools amongst certain countries. North Korea and Iran have shared information about trying to develop nuclear weapons, but they do the same with cyber attacks. Obviously, within the Five Eyes, the five English speaking, let me make sure, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, USA, and the UK, they share a lot of intelligence amongst each other and techniques amongst each other. So I think that there's natural military alliances. There's not a lot of evidence that China and Russia share a lot in terms of cyber, but we don't really know. I mean, that's probably not available to us. Another question: who can we trust? How can we know which firm to trust or not? I think the problem is if a firm is in another country that has vested in people like Kaspersky is no great surprise. Kaspersky is going to only operate in Russia if he has the permission and the approval of the Russian government, and obviously in Russia that means you have to do what the intelligence services tell you, and that's the problem. I mean, the US, maybe you're in a better position or maybe not, because the problem is effectively if the NSA are looking for something that you're doing, maybe they've got more reason, maybe they don't, depends. Julian Assange might think differently. And that's the problem is I think you need to understand what's the background of a company, where are they based. I mean, a lot of Israeli companies working in security, I don't know whether it's bad for business if they aren't trustworthy, but I think it's actually a really good question. And that's probably thinking about internationally organisations, cybersecurity organisations you might want to trust. I think you've got to be very careful. And I suppose the problem is, and this is in Russia, but it's also in America, a lot of people coming out of these agencies that have done this really high-level work for the NSA or for Russian military intelligence, they're going into private industry, and sometimes they're sharing those techniques and with people that perhaps are a little less particular about who they might attack. I know the NSA, a bunch of NSA people went to work for a company called Black Matter in the UAE, in the Emirates, and Black Matter was supposedly hired them to try and hunt down some terrorists, which seems reasonable enough. Eventually, they were actually going after dissidents and journalists. So sometimes these really high-level techniques developed by countries that sort of pride themselves on their interest in freedom of speech, those techniques are being used in more oppressive ways. So Dick asked a question: how can we give cybersecurity a firm place in education, and can you recommend a framework or good practice? I think the thing about cybersecurity is I think we need to teach people cybersecurity, and certainly where the university I was in Australia, we taught cybersecurity for first-year students, at the very start of their course. So it's got to be a fundamental thing. People understand the threats there. People writing software, people using computer systems. In fact, we wanted all students to do cybersecurity, not just technology students. In terms of frameworks and good practice, I mean, there's so many, but NIST itself, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which is a US organization, has some fantastic frameworks. MITRE Corporation, which is a not-for-profit in America, again, have some fantastic cybersecurity information that you can, and good practice around cybersecurity practices. But there's any number. So another question back about Russia is how is the strategy of Russia to divide the European countries? I think probably disinformation is all about trying to spread a story that's going to divide, and that's the clever thing about disinformation is it's not about convincing the other side that you're right. It's about getting the other side to argue with each other, and that's why in 2016 a lot of the activity was around Black Lives Matter. The Russians created this group called Blacks Matter. Blacks Matter was called, and basically it was mimicking BLM, the Black Lives Matter, saying showing all these photos of police officers beating up black people because it's a not because they're trying to convince people that blacks are treated poorly by law enforcement in America. You may think they might think not, but it's about dividing America. Because the thing is, in America, there's this divide between those that look at the police as racists, as people that will harass them unfairly, and those that think the police are protecting them from crime. And that division is one they want to widen. And so that's why things like that are actually promoted in these attempts to divide people. There's lots of information from government organisations. Another question here about warning about cyber attacks. I think the US government does a fantastic job in terms of information about cyber attacks that are happening. But also there's an excellent organisation that NATO runs in Estonia called the Centre of Excellence for Cybersecurity. Any number of organisations, really. It's probably so many I can't really mention, but the thing is, I think any organisation that is serious about cybersecurity needs to, at the very first step, is understand their threat profile. What are you doing? Who would it be of interest to? Who are those people, and what's their capability? You need to understand who your enemy is and what they're likely to do. And then you can start thinking about what do you need to do about it. Because you've got to be informed in your approach. Obviously, there's what we call hygiene, security hygiene. But in the end, you need to have a much more nuanced understanding of what the attacks are going to look like before you develop, you spend your $1 trillion on whatever defense you're going to do. You need to understand that. And you look at how the military operates. They don't do anything without understanding their adversary. The US only has aircraft carriers because they know they want to protect their power against certain countries. They only buy certain sorts of aircraft for that reason. So everything's for a purpose about an adversary. And cyber's the same. And it should be the same for organisations. Now, you might be a pathway. Like, I talked about CSC before, and we were a pathway to various government organisations that the Chinese were after in that case. So you need to understand that as well. But it's about having that informed approach to understand what the threats are going to be. So is there one state actor that stands out in knowledge and capability? I suppose pound for pound, as I think the American expression might be, Israel's probably the most significant state actor. For a small country, they're very, very, very capable and highly trained organisations, and a private industry that supports that. The concerning thing there is we see Israelis working for various governments with less than good human rights records. So that's the problem, is this knowledge is getting out there to others that can afford to pay for their services. So with that, we've got a few minutes left. So basically, I will share my slides. There's a few videos there you can watch Plus, there might be more information there you want to read about. I had a lot of slides to get through. I probably flew through them. By all means, have a look through. If you've got some questions, we'll share our email. If you want to send me some questions or one of my team some questions, we're happy to answer them. But hopefully, this has been a brief introduction to the world of nation-state cyber attacks. As you can see, many countries are doing this sort of thing. But it's really important to understand who's coming after you. I think that's probably the message I'd like to give to you. With that, thanks for your attention, and I'll hopefully hear from you online.